There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
So today we're going to begin the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew was not only a disciple of Jesus Christ, but he was also called to be an apostle. And Matthew, he never identifies himself as the writer in his gospel or in any of the text of his gospel. But this title, Matthew, it appears all the way back to the earliest of the manuscripts. And so the title of the book, Matthew, is considered to be original. And the only reason that titles became necessary for the Gospels was to be able to distinguish them one from another as those scrolls were being circulated around. And throughout all four of the Gospel, there's not one spoken word of Matthew ever recorded. Matthew never talked about himself, and nobody ever said anything that he had ever said. You don't hear Matthew having a conversation with Jesus or asking him any questions. And there's no dialogue of Matthew's with any of the other disciples. Matthew, he only recorded the words that Jesus spoke and the things that were pertaining to him. These were the words that were important to him. So Matthew, he's a very humble writer. He doesn't tell us about himself at all. Now, it's not known if Matthew was the first gospel ever written, but some think it was. And some even think that Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, was originally written in Hebrew, and that Matthew translated his Hebrew text into Greek about the year 60 AD. But that's all speculation. There's absolutely no reason to believe that this gospel was ever written in Hebrew, because Matthew, he had a great command of the Greek language. Because as we'll see, Matthew, he worked for the government. He worked for Rome, and Romans, they spoke Greek because that was the language of the world. And even though Matthew may not have been the first written gospel, Matthew always appears first in every New Testament, even from the ancient copies. And that's absolutely perfect because Matthew's gospel is actually the bridge. It's the bridge that connects the Old Testament to the New Testament. The last words that were ever spoken in the Old Testament that was written by Malachi in the book of Malachi, it was 400 years prior to Jesus coming. And after those words were written, it was absolutely silent. God didn't speak. He didn't say one word. He did not have one prophet. He didn't write a book. It was just 400 long years of silence. But after those 400 years of silence, Jesus came into the world and God's word exploded. And with Jesus himself even being called the Word of God. So this gospel, according to Matthew, this helps us to make sense of how the two testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament, how they're connected together. And so that we can see the Bible as one book written by the same one God. And so Matthew, how he does this is by starting with Old Testament genealogies. He connects Jesus as being a descendant of King David and of Abraham, the father of the nation. And he tells us all the history, and he brings in all the history of Israel. And this is really good because Matthew's original audience would have been predominantly Jewish. Matthew's gospel was written for the Jews in the same way that Mark's gospel was written for the Romans, and where the gospel of Luke was written to the Greeks. And Matthew, knowingly writing to the Jews, he uses 99 direct quotations from the Old Testament scriptures. And that makes a total of 129 references to the Old Testament. And the Gospel of Matthew, it's the book of fulfillment, because all he goes through and he does is he shows the fulfillment of all these Old Testament prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. And there's a really good reason why Matthew had a good working knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures. And that's because Matthew was a Levite. He was from the tribe of Levi. And so Matthew, he can present a very Jewish gospel. And the way we know that this is true is that in Matthew's writing of his gospel, he assumes that his readers are all familiar with Jewish culture. Matthew, he uses Aramaic words, and he does it without translating them into the Greek. And that's because he knows that his Jewish readers know what those words mean. And Matthew, he also refers to Jewish customs without explaining them, because he wouldn't have had to explain them. Because to his Jewish readers, they would have been everyday things. They would need no explanation. And the reason that we know that Matthew was a Levite is because the same person named Matthew, he's identified in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 2:14, and in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 5, verse 27. But in these two Gospels, the person who's named Matthew is identified as the man named Levi, the tax gatherer. But it's the same exact person in Matthew's Gospel. In Matthew's Gospel, he's called Matthew. And Matthew does this without telling us that he's even talking about himself. And there's a thing, we always know that a lot of people back at that time, they had two names. That was real common. And many people actually believe that Jesus himself probably changed Levi's name to Matthew, just like Jesus changed Simon's name to Peter, the same kind of thing. And the name Matthew means gift of God. And I think it's very possible that Matthew, he doesn't identify himself as the same man that he was before he met Jesus. He doesn't see himself any longer as Levi the tax gatherer after Jesus had called him to follow him. Levi the tax gatherer to him was his pre-Christ life, and he was no longer the same man. He'd been changed, and now he's Matthew. Now he's the gift of God. And because that his name was Levi, we know that it's definite that he was of the tribe of Levi, and he would have been set apart. His life would have revolved around serving at the temple. It's very possible that he would have very well have been a priest, but you can't prove that. But he could have been actually from the line of Aaron. But there's something that we need to know about tax gatherers. And tax gatherers are also called publicans, and they were hated. I'm saying publican, I'm not saying Republican. You know, though there's a lot of Republicans that are hated these days. But if I had to guess about Levi, I'd probably say he was a Democrat, because he really did like to gather taxes. But tax gatherers, they didn't have a very good reputation. They were considered to be liars. They were considered to be thieves. It's kind of the same way how we see tax gatherers today. It sounds a lot like our tax system. And we even see Jesus classify these publicans or tax gatherers as being in the same group as prostitutes and sinners. They were to have had the very lowest moral character in the Jewish society. And now Matthew, he would have had to have purchased the right to be able to gather taxes from the Roman government. And the way it worked was the more money that he could gather for Rome, the more money he would be able to keep for himself. And so you have to ask yourself, well, how does this happen? How does a good Jewish boy leave the work of serving in God's temple into becoming a part of the evil Roman Empire, and to take the hard-earned money from your own people, from the Jews, and to hand it over to the enemy of the Jews, to the Romans? So how did Matthew become a sellout, a traitor of his own people? Well, it's very possible that Matthew, he saw the corruption and all the hypocrisy that was involved in the temple worship. And in the temple, and how those who were in charge, and the people that were in charge were basically the Sadducees. They were the priests that came down from Zadok, that they had all become political now. And so the temple was being run by a corrupt priesthood, and they were gouging their very own people for a ridiculous amount of profit, and they would do it anywhere they could get it. And so these priests were actually gouging the very common people who actually loved God, and they were taking advantage of these poor people. And these were the people who actually desired to know God and to worship God, because the temple was the only place that any Jew could worship God, because that's the only place that God would allow any type of sacrifice. It all had to occur at the temple. So these Sadducees, these priests, knowing that for the people to be made right with God, that they had to go through them, and they became very greedy. They overcharged for everything, for every sacrifice, for every offering. And so the temple, it became big business. And the priests, they made themselves rich. And all of this was on the backs of God's people. So this Matthew, who was a Levite, who may have even been a priest, he saw that the temple worship had just become a big religious sham. And he knew that it was full of hypocrisy and that the priests were ripping the people off for their money. So instead of Matthew just becoming another religious hypocrite like the rest of them, he must have come to the conclusion that everything was about money and about power. And so he figured that he might as well just sell out to Rome directly. And he even knew that the priests, that they had their own deals with Rome. They did it secretly. We see that in Jesus' ministry, where the Romans were allowing them to run their business. So they had their own deals. And so I figure that what Matthew was thinking is that he would just knock out the middleman, and he would just sell out to Rome directly without all the religious trappings. So he would still be ripping off the people, but he wouldn't be a hypocrite. He would be more honest than the priests. And we know that being a hypocrite, it really bothered Matthew, because he uses that word hypocrite 31 times in his gospel. He uses the word hypocrite more than any other gospel writer. In fact, he uses that word hypocrite than the whole rest of the Bible combined. So it kind of seems like Matthew is saying, well, I might be a thief, but I'm not a hypocrite. I'm not hiding behind religion. And so Matthew, as Levi the tax gatherer, he would have had the whole authority of Rome behind him. And so there would actually be a literal Roman guard that would literally be standing behind him with a spear in his hand behind Matthew's little tax booth. And that's to enforce the payment of taxes to Rome. And those who would be taxed would be anybody that would be traveling through his area. And he would even be enforcing it not only from the travelers, but he would be enforcing it from his own people, the Jews. And so all Jews hated tax collectors. And so that means that all of Matthew's friends, well, they wouldn't have been Jews. They would have all been mostly Gentile Romans.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.